Hello. Today, in my presentation titled Intercultural Communication in Octavio Paz's The Labyrinth of Solitude, I'll examine one of the most canonical texts from 20th century Mexico, or indeed from the long history of Latin America, namely Octavio Paz's The Labyrinth of Solitude, or El Labyrinto de la Soledad. Today, or whenever you watch this, I am to show you how we can make Paz's rich, ambitious text meaningful for today's undergraduates. How can we teach Paz's text in a way that advances rather than impedes cultural awareness? Indeed, it hasn't always been read this way. So how to elaborate a scholarly and pedagogically valid interpretation of Paz's texts that tasks undergraduates to celebrate cultural diversity even while accounting for the text's historical context. By employing intercultural communication's conceptual toolkit, I read Paz's interpretation of Mexico as both coherent and compelling, and indeed, even enlightened. First, a bit about me and about where I came from for this project. My name is Kevin Anzzolin, and I am an assistant professor of Spanish at the University of Wisconsin-Stout, where I teach Spanish language and literature. I graduated with my PhD in Romance languages from the University of Chicago in 2014. My research focuses primarily on Mexican narrative from the 19th and 20th centuries, and my publications have appeared in Letras Hispanas, Studies in Latin American Popular Culture, among other places. That is, I am first and foremost a literature or cultural studies scholar, and thus my comments today should be understood as a non-specialist attempt to take the lessons of one particular field of study, namely intercultural communication, and apply them to my field of specialization. I believe ultimately that my findings are especially apt for the political environment in which we're currently living. It was only last year when I began to apply intercultural communications ideas to a text that is more commonly read in literature and history classes. I was at a different institution where, for the first time, I was tasked with teaching an intercultural communications course. There simply weren't enough students enrolled in Spanish courses to fulfill my load, and so in June when I was hired, I had to hurry up and educate myself about the field of intercultural communications, the work of Edward T. Hall, Gertz Hofstede, and others who had forged the field of study during the mid-century and after. In that sense, and I would like to reiterate this, my comments today are educated but certainly not expert. One other comment about the institution I was previously at, it was a small regional state university that was in a notably rural area. In recent years, the school had experienced the effects, or perhaps better said, the side effects, of the oil boom brought upon by fracking technology. That is, it was a traditionally rural, Anglo-American, and quite conservative place, but it had experienced a population boom which brought new diversity to the area. The university, too, had done a good job of bringing in international students from faraway places, which very much enriched the life world of the university, but did indeed cause a bit of disquiet as different folks summed each other up. With all this in mind, and against the backdrop of the unlikely and unfortunate election of Donald Trump in November 2016, I began to look at one of Latin America's most canonical texts, a text which I teach almost every year, with new eyes. My reading of the text was, admittedly and thankfully, very informed, in that sense, by my time and place. First, the briefest description about what Octavio Paz's text is, and indeed, for those of you not been exposed to the cultural and history of Latin America, it may be somewhat difficult to adequately express how deeply canonical the text is. Octavio Paz's Labyrinth was first published in 1950 and is a collection of essays about the quote-unquote Mexican character. Paz's text is divided into two. While the first half of the book is dedicated to how Mexicanness is manifested in everyday life, Mexico's celebrations, the collective personality traits of its citizenry, and the character of its language. The second half of the book outlines those historical experiences which were formative for that national character. These foundational experiences of the conquest and colonization have created, to use Freudian terminology, contemporary symptoms, particular to Mexico, which have yet to be worked through or recaffected. In that sense, the first half of the book is symptomology, the second half, etiology. Mexico's history is understood as a psychological drama, and the text itself, in moving from contemporary characteristics to their historical origins, mimics the way in which the conscious mind dialectically works upon itself. Thus, in a markedly Freudian way, repetition, a search for the past, is both the cause and the cure for the illness that is Mexicanness. The book is an extended talking cure, as Paz diagnoses Mexico. In this way, the uneven development of the Mexican nation state is not different than that of the individual. Over 60 years after Paz's ambitious text was first published, his theories are both scorned and celebrated. The Labyrinth is still widely read, debated, and enjoyed. Teaching his Labyrinth is a somewhat dicey proposition in our current political climate. The 2016 presidential election stirred up the baser impulses of everyday Americans. Twisted notions regarding a supposed need for a racially and linguistically homogeneous U.S. Have renewed talk of borders. Amid such conditions, Paz's text could be, incorrectly I would suggest, read as supporting a vision of Mexicans as innately violent, sexually charged, revelry-seeking, and, in short, dangerous. Many scholars have critiqued Paz for showing the worst side of what is presented as the irrevocable, immutable destiny of the Mexican. That is, Paz's reading could be read as stereotypical, if not completely crass. First, we should note that Paz was a contemporary of Edward T. Hall's, and I believe in a real sense, their projects are quite similar. Working as a diplomat, Paz, like Hall, spent a considerable time interrogating how best to communicate across cultures. Although not trained as an anthropologist, Paz undoubtedly has a remarkably keen eye for cultural traits. Thus, Hall's and Paz's respective works are two attempts of many at the mid-century to interrogate cultural relations in a word poignantly aware of the dire consequences of intercultural miscommunication. While intercultural communications terms provide a pragmatically oriented and anthropologically verifiable scheme with which to understand cultural differences, Paz's poetic and psychoanalytic unfolding of the quote-unquote Mexican character expresses both the beauty and the pain of living in a world where cultural differences exist. Both authors are looking for a way out of a lonely labyrinth, a post-war political stage gripped by the tense reticence of Cold War detente. In other ways, Paz's project coincides with that of intercultural communication. Indeed, I believe that Paz's text can be deciphered, at least in part, by evoking Hofstede's 5 dimensions. Thus, we can think of intercultural communication's discussion of high context versus low context cultures. As Newliup explains, a high context culture is one in which, quote, meanings are gleaned from the physical, social, and psychological contexts, while low context culture is one which, quote, meanings are encoded in the verbal code. Those interactants in a high context culture thus need to decipher a nonverbal and restricted code that consists largely of gestures, proxemics, and tone of voice. It is in this context, rather than by the actual words exchanged, which more dramatically informs the interaction between individuals and which conveys meaning interpersonally. In this type of cultural setting, physical space is crucial, as is the status of those who interact. In low context cultures, alternatively, meaning between participants is expressed primarily via complex verbal constructions. Requests, doubts, fears, and desires are spelled out explicitly. Thus, while the United States is, in broad terms, a low context culture, Mexico exemplifies a high context culture. One only needs to stroll through New York's Times Square at night, illuminated by an improbable but orderly hodgepodge of floating neon words, to realize that the United States is a low context society. With but a smattering of English and a healthy bank account, one can, in fact, find their way, obtaining tickets to a Broadway play, a Sabrett hot dog, or a late show souvenir. Alternatively, one only need visit the market in Ocosingo, Chiapas, to understand Mexico as a high context society. Pushing one's way through the cobbled, crowded side streets, ducking under a tarp stretched across a metal pole like an awning, we hear the loopy whistle of the knife sharpener as he offers to magically and wordlessly transform the back of his moped into a wedding stone. Explaining cultural differences in this way, I propose, immediately renders Paz's description of the quote Mexican character, and likewise the counterpoised American character, as far less cryptic, less susceptible to stereotypical readings and flat, facile oversimplifications. Rather, they appear as Paz intended them to be, as both myths and realities. In the Mexican Masks chapter, Paz describes the Mexican in the following way. The Mexican, whether young or old, general or laborer or lawyer, seems to be the only person who shuts himself away to protect himself. His face is a mask, and so is his smile. In his harsh solitude, which is both barbed and courteous, everything serves him as a defense. Silence and words, politeness and disdain, irony and resignation. He is jealous of his own privacy and that of others, and he is afraid even to glance at his neighbor, because a mere glance can trigger the rage of those electrically charged spirits. In high context societies like Mexico, Paz too understands that circumlocutory asides are privileged over precise communiques. Such is, at least in part, what Paz refers to as the quote love of form. Although Paz, the poet and occasional surrealist, cannot help but describe his countrymen via elliptical prose, tussled by an undercurrent of violence, and if we read between the lines, his account of Mexican culture, at heart, could be very well found in a guidebook for diplomats visiting a foreign land. In yet other ways, Paz's notion of a high context culture illuminates Paz's interpretation of Mexico. In a high context society, one's self-concept may not always be compatible with one's public behavior. Individuals are deeply interdependent. Communicative codes are restricted, and approval from society is of the utmost importance. To make organizations run smoothly, to maintain the status quo, and perhaps to bring peace of mind to the greatest number of people, citizens are expected to assume a role they have been assigned almost since birth. In such a society, perhaps even a single political party can be elected for upwards of 70 years. Allusions, rather than explicit expressions, triumph in high context cultures. And this, paired with an aversion to social mobility, creates a scenario in which individuals are asked to be what they are not. Paz describes his representative Mexican as a dissembler, who pretends to be something he is not. His role requires constant improvisation, a steady forward progress across shifting sands. Every moment he must remake, recreate, modify the personage he is playing, until at last the moment arrives when reality and appearance, the lie and the truth, are one. In the Labyrinth, Paz describes a Mexican society, perhaps not satisfied, but at least stupefied by the status quo. Born into a stable but oftentimes undignified social role, The Mexican maintains a lie so as to grease the wheels of hierarchical society. The rule of day in Mexico all too often seems to be go with the flow. Accept the life you were born into. Don't make waves. Keep on keeping on. Inertia becomes the most ready response of the great majority. Paz represents the Mexican as duplicitous, but only to the extent that he or she wants to survive. This brings us to another of intercultural communication's more potent concepts, power distance. Hofstede explains power distance as the dispersal of status within society. Cultures that express a large power distance are those where inequality is more readily accepted and oftentimes understood as a natural aspect of life. Low power distance cultures, alternatively, are those in which individuals, although they may belong to distinct social classes, do not experience an inordinate imbalance of power. In such cultures, subordinates can and do challenge their superiors. People queue up to decide who should be attended to first, and in business meetings, underlings can make suggestions for improving company procedures. In his own way, Paz signals the notion of power distance very clearly in his distinction of the Mexican American living in Los Angeles, who, neither assimilated to nor acculturated within U.S. society, is rendered the most fragmented of subjects, a dispossessed wanderer. Paz explains, "When I arrived to the United States, I was surprised above all by the self-assurance and confidence of the people, their apparent happiness and apparent adjustment to the world around them. This satisfaction did not stifle criticism, however, and the criticism is valuable and forthright, of a sort not often heard in the countries of the South, where long periods of dictatorship have made us more cautious about expressing our points of view." Paz notes that in the United States, a low power distance culture, one is less impeded from criticizing his or her superior. For all are, at the end of the day, peers. In Latin America, adversely, Paz claims that individuals are cautious about expressing dissent, as the culture is characterized by a large power distance. In this passage, Paz, attempting to elaborate an etiology of cultural symptoms, somewhat convincingly locates Latin America's naggingly undemocratic character in its experience with dictatorships. Later on, in El Labyrinthos, the Sons of Malinche chapter, Paz pinpoints Mexico's unequal power relationships in what effectively constitutes the primal scene of the Mexican nation, the sexual encounter of Hernan Cortés and Doña Marina. I believe that what Paz signals as distinctly a Mexican fear of invasion, whether those invading be 16th century Spaniards or 20th century Americans, ultimately coincides with another more formidable terms from intercultural communication's conceptual toolkit, namely uncertainty avoidance. For Hofstede, the notion of uncertainty avoidance is used to account for the fact that in some cultures, individuals express a far greater fear of the foreign, the abnormal, or the unexpected. Cultures with a high uncertainty avoidance may be more likely to antagonize outsider elements. In such a culture, strangers are confronted with the steely sound of closing doors, terse action, and squinting suspicion. Significantly, these are among the tactics employed by Paz's Mexicism. Paz tells us, "Hermetism is one of the several resources of our suspicion and distrust. It shows that we instinctively regard the world around us as dangerous." Paz, like Hofstede, notes that such cultures are inclined to extreme vacillations in comportment, as individuals swing between reticent distrust and energetic bellicose confrontation. If we were to deepen Paz's penchant for Freudianism, we might say that the Mexican's bipolarity, moving between puerile fits of anger and feigned audacity, is ultimately symptomatic of his weak ego formation. As Paz explains, quote, "Unforeseen violence that lacerates us by the solemn or convulsive splendor of our fiestas, by our cult of death." What better description could be offered by both a diplomatic attaché as well as a poet than that which Paz offers here? I read it as almost a textbook example of of an acute intercultural communication breakdown. Mexican culture's heightened uncertainty avoidance and concomitant focus on corporeal, on the body, is also indicative of its deep-seated collectivism, an intercultural communication term already explained above. Again, while in individualistic cultures, people strive to realize self-fulfillment and autonomy, those in collectivistic cultures feel mutually obligated to each other and aim for in-group harmony and interdependence. Understanding Mexican society as a collectivistic culture also serves us to interpret Paz's description of fiestas. Facile readings of The Labyrinth have all too often emphasized the bacchanalian aspect of holidays in Mexico, rather than stressing the fact that they are, that is, the las fiestas, that they are culturally significant due to their collectivistic character. Ultimately, this interpretive misstep has promoted stereotypical, ahistorical, and shallow thinking about about both Paz and about Mexico. Paz explains the collectivistic aspect of Mexican society with the following. The solitary Mexican loves fiestas and public gatherings. Any occasion for getting together will serve, any pretext to stop the flow of time and commemorate men and events with festivals and ceremonies. We are a ritual people, and this characteristic enriches both our imagination and our sensibilities, which are equally sharp and alert. The art of the fiesta has been debased almost everywhere else, but not in Mexico. This passage, too, can be analyzed via intercultural communications terminology. Not only does it allow us to signal the collectivistic and spatial aspect of Mexican fiestas, that is to say, these spectacular public ceremonies that take place in plazas and markets, but it also gestures towards Mexico's distinctive relationship to temporality. That's to say, according to Paz, no matter the time of year or what work obligations may be, everything is a good excuse for a party. Indeed, much of Paz's All Saints, Day of the Dead chapter deals with Mexico's conception of time vis-a-vis the nation's festivals. According to Paz, Mexico's insatiable hunger for parties, and moreover for the collectivistic, can never properly jibe with national or liturgical calendars. Quote, time is no longer succession, and becomes what it originally was and is, the present, in which past and future are reconciled. But the fiestas which the church and state provide for the country as a whole are not enough. The life of every city and village is ruled by a patron saint whose blessing is celebrated with devout regularity. And each one of us, atheist, Catholic, or merely indifferent, has his own saint's day, which he observes every year. With this, Paz convincingly describes how chronologies, either religious or national, have been imposed upon Mexican society at different points in history. Although Paz's distinctive prose may render these impositions as somewhat opaque, he is ultimately describing a broader process of modernity, time awareness, and work discipline such as that thoroughly outlined by another of his contemporaries, E.P. Thompson. Significant for our considerations here is the fact that intercultural communications founder, Edward T. Hall, in The Silent Language, describes the particularly cultural valence of time roughly a decade before Thompson's Time, Work, Discipline, and Industrial Capitalism article. Like Thompson and moreover like Paz, Haas also proposes a scenario of dueling and culturally specific temporalities. Some chronologies are imposed from above, others take root in a sui generis manner. Intercultural communication understands those cultures that evince a diminished sense of scheduling, a lesser need to compartmentalize time, and an orientation toward the past as polychronic. Polychronic or P-time cultures also demonstrate more flexibility in terms of allowing for multiple activities to take place simultaneously. Alternatively, monochronic or M-time cultures are oriented toward the future and emphasize the measurement of time and the maintenance of a tight schedule. Although it would be dubious to categorize any culture as either exclusively polychronic or exclusively monochronic, anyone who has hoped hopped in a colectivo in Mexico, tried to grab a waiter's attention during a major sporting event, or taken part in business meetings would naturally understand our southern neighbors as generally oriented towards pea time. Paz explicitly describes Mexico's polychronic orientation, even against the false imposition of M time, when he describes how, quote, during fiestas, time is no longer succession and becomes what it originally was and is, the present, in which past and future are reconciled. In the undergraduate classroom, such a discussion serves to counter those more injurious interpretations which brand Mexicans merely as party animals, dawdlers, or even lazy. Understanding the labyrinth via intercultural communications time terminology provides instructors with an opportunity to discuss how subjects are subsumed by capitalist modes of production, and ultimately made to understand that time is money. Finally, instructors can also historicize the practice of celebrating something like Saint Monday, which saw work disciplines that had been handed down by colonists briefly upended by polychronic and carnivalesque crapulence. Ultimately, Paz's text is characterized by a multitude of cultural voices. Be of both form and content, the labyrinth demands that readers open themselves up to diversity. Today, I propose a novel interpretation of The Labyrinth, which casts the foremost intellectual of 20th century Mexico not as a loutish promoter of macho men behaving badly in the name of skewed notions of authentic Mexican identity, but rather as a subtle, poetic mind who apprehends cultural identity dialectically and diplomatically. Paz's text shares many of the same concerns that the field of intercultural communications takes on. Here, by activating some of the terminology from this field, I have attempted to unknot Paz's highly stylized prose, and thus shed light on his more diplomatic-minded concerns, as well as his understanding of Mexican culture as an ongoing process that, for better or for worse, is subjected to reification. The fact that Paz's literary flourishes oftentimes occlude his keen anthropological observations should not, I argue, diminish his ambitious cultural interpretation of Mexican society. This reading of Paz will better serve our multicultural classrooms, both now and in the future. It is, I argue, more befitting for our present political moment, when the notion of a racially and linguistically homogeneous United States has once again heinously gotten ample airplay, been promoted by television pundits, and even found its way onto the platform of a major political party during the 2016 presidential elections. In short, rather than building walls between teachers, students, and cultures, Paz's The Labyrinth continues to challenge us, over 60 years after its publication, to cross pedagogical, scholarly, and especially politically and cultural borders. Thank you.